So we're going to start our third panel of the day, which concerns the role of government in shaping universities. I'm Mark Harding. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph, and I'm pleased to be here and to be moderating this panel, and want to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for all their efforts for bringing us all together today. So we've got a great panel of speakers to work through this important topic, and so I'll just briefly introduce each one of them, and then we'll get to some conversation from each one of them. So we have Ryan Alford, who is a professor in law at Lakehead University. And importantly, Ryan is also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He has recently authored a fantastic paper on the state of freedom of expression in Canada that has just come out, and if you haven't read that, I highly recommend that you do. I don't think I'll embarrass Ryan too much by saying I think it's the best thing that Ryan's written, and I say that as someone who's a big fan of his 2020 book, 7 Absolute Rights. If you haven't read that, I'd recommend picking up a copy as well. Then we have Ian Brody. Ian Brody is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. He's the author of several books, including At the Center of Government, and he also has held a number of prominent positions within the Conservative Party of Canada and the Government of Canada, including Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper from 2006 to 2008, which I believe, Ian, was the Canada's New Government phase. And I've noticed that phrase is back in parlance now, but it's not as controversial now as it was circa 2006 for reasons that I don't know. Ian also writes an excellent Substack called The Thursday Question, and I highly recommend that you subscribe, and you should add that to your diet of news and opinion consumption. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Peter MacKinnon. So Peter has a distinguished career within academia. He served as a professor and dean of the law school at the University of Saskatchewan. He also served as the president of that institution and has served as the president of several other Canadian universities, including Athabasca, Dalhousie, and briefly as the director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Peter's written several books, and I just got a signed copy of Confronting Illiberalism from Peter this morning, and I highly recommend you check that book out as well if you're interested in our conversations here today. And Peter's been doing a lot of really great writing in the National Post about matters related to post-secondary education, and so I would recommend having a look at each of those. So what we're going to do is have each one of our panelists start with an opening statement of 5 or 10 minutes or so, and they're going to speak in the order with which they've been introduced. And so I'm going to hand things over to Professor Ryan Alford.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And I'd like to say his writing is spectacular. And if you haven't read his latest book, which I highly recommend, I think you should go out and get it. With respect to how we framed this panel, we thought about things that occurred recently with a couple of approaches to reforming higher education. One being the report that essentially came out of the Manhattan Institute in the United States. It's normally associated with one of its chief authors, Chris Rufo, about how to reform higher education, essentially with the assistance of government or kind of external approaches to reconfiguring education reform. And the other that came out of the Heterodox Academy, which is essentially about an internal reform process and how we can kind of realign universities in various ways. I should also mention one of our fellows here, Eric Kaufman, was responsible for a third, somewhat orthogonally aligned approach, and that was called, I think, the Buckingham Manifesto. And so I don't think you're going to see a big difference of opinion, and certainly not a debate between the panelists about one model being the correct model and other ones being the incorrect models. But it's more a question of how we can do this best according to each modality. So my view on governmental intervention in education is probably a function of my service in teaching more than anything else, because it has to do a lot with what we can expect as students when they're coming into our faculties and then when they leave our faculties. And essentially how we create standards that lead to growth and lead to measurable impacts along certain variables that are now being measured in ways that are causing alarm, as we heard this morning, for instance, involving literacy. So I've taught in 3 institutions over the course of, I think, a biblical generation. And there have been different approaches to standards in the 3 institutions in which I taught. I would say when I came into law teaching in the United States at a school called Ave Maria School of Law, we couldn't rely on getting top-tier students just based on kind of the stratification of law schools. If you teach in sort of this category of law school, you know that your students will have a certain profile with respect to things like GPA and with respect to standardized test scores, namely LSAT. So we knew, and by the way, LSAT, interestingly, was all the research that's been done showed that it had a very, very high correlation with success. Its R value was very high in comparison to any other measure that would predict success in law school, right? So grades, LSAT, tight correlation. Our students are coming in with very low LSAT scores by virtue of our institutional reputation as a brand new faculty. What we did is we told the entering class, at the end of the first year, 10% of you will not return. We have a mandatory fail-out rate in the first year of 10%. It's very motivating. Having that external standard say this is what you need to attain in order to continue, it led to a very different type of classroom experience. It led to a very different kind of educational experience. And as much as you might think that interorum effect is very negative, I can tell you that it wasn't. And I can also say with a lot of certainty, it wasn't the people that you would expect based on kind of models that kind of animate DEI or EDI thinking. What you would expect based on those models was very rarely borne out. The most important function was not demographic to predict where that 10% would be. The most important variable was motivation. So people who came in with very high motivation, generally speaking, did not find themselves within that tranche that was not returning the second year. When I came to Lakehead from University of Victoria, so University of Victoria, that was in the middle of those 2 institutions. I came to Lakehead, which was a brand new faculty. I came at the end of the first year. We had to prove ourselves as a faculty. And we said, how are we going to show that our graduates are as good as graduates from any other institution? And that was kind of internal, right? That we said to ourselves, with this internal motivation, we're going to produce a high quality educational experience. The index of how successful we were is this. Within 3 years, so by the time that we had a class going out and taking licensing exams to become lawyers in Ontario, by that time, we became the most successful in producing people who passed those examinations. We had the highest pass rate in a brand new school with students with not the highest GPA profile, not the highest LSAT profile, the highest rate of passing the licensing exam. And believe me, law students are motivated to pass those exams because if they don't, they cannot practice, they will likely lose their offers at the various law firms that they're scheduled to join, right? Now, interestingly, and I think that this is maybe part of the problem that we'll all be discussing today, the Law Society of Ontario did not allow my faculty or Lakehead University to publicize that fact. We were not allowed to tell people our graduates passed license exams at a higher rate than University of Toronto or Western University or Queen's University. We weren't allowed to say that, right? Because essentially there's been a movement away from standards generally. I think something that maybe we could have highlighted or maybe will come out of reflecting on what we've been talking about over the course of these panels is this notion of EDI or this notion of equity specifically, right? Or what motivates it, what propels it, this notion of systemic oppression. Is it compatible not only with excellence, is it compatible with the notion of standards, right? Can you have standards? Can you enforce standards? If you come out of this mentality that, well, the driving force, the key variable driving success on any metric is where people fall in this matrix of oppressor and oppressed, right? So when I'm looking at universities and thinking about governmental intervention, it doesn't have to be standards that are explicitly ideological. If they were merely standards of even the most basic things like literacy, as we heard about this morning, right? Reading comprehension, any kind of basic standard, it would provide a basis to say you're doing a good job and you're doing a bad job, and to say, well, you might lose some funding if we can't rely on this. If the BA no longer has any signaling function whatsoever as to whether or not someone is capable of doing more complex jobs performing more complex tasks than someone who doesn't have a BA, right? What is the province paying for? So if we're trying to think about how we align this issue and don't fall into this trap of, okay, well, is governmental intervention the way forward or is internal reform the way forward? Maybe we should just think about how we can enforce the standards so that we can have some kind of pressure of the kind that always produces a better learning environment, rather than just something that says, our job here is to push you through, cash the checks, credential you, and put you out on the market. Maybe that's just a food for thought for our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Next, Ian Brody. Ian.
Thank you, Mark. Let me just say off the top, I think the prospects for government-driven reform of the post-secondary system, particularly of university sector in Canada, are dim. If you're going to accomplish any of these reforms, you really do need the minister on side. In Alberta, that's the Minister of Advanced Education. The portfolio has been around since 2004. The Minister of Advanced Education is a busy person. We have 4 research universities in Alberta, or we tell ourselves we have 4 research universities in Alberta. There are 8 smaller universities in the public system, 5 polytechnics, 8 community colleges, 5 First Nations colleges, and the Banff Centre. We only have 2 hours here, so I won't try to explain what the Banff Centre is to the group. The minister also has 6 ministerial advisory committees and regulatory bodies to oversee. It's a massive enterprise. The ministry on its own spent just over $580 million last year, and the public institutions another $6.7 billion for a total of $7.2 billion in the minister's ambit. As in all provinces, the minister is ideally assisted by being able to make a lot of political appointments into the system, although those of you who worked in government will realize that the political appointments are made primarily by the Premier's office rather than by the minister's office. The 6 advisory committees in the department have 70 members between them. And then you add in the universities, polytechnic, and college boards. Let's call those 300 appointees altogether. Ideally, they will help the minister, but in fact, they require the minister and the minister's staff a lot of care and feeding of the political appointees. They're almost all volunteers. They all have day jobs. Since they don't get paid, the job they're doing for the minister may not have their full attention or may not be their top priority of all the things that they have to do. Moreover, in Alberta, there's a lot of changeover in the minister's offices. In the 21 years that the department has existed, we've had 11 ministers. That means a new one every 23 months. If that sounds like a short time for the minister to be on the job, I mean, considering a BA is a 4-year BA if you're doing it full time, the average student in Alberta sees 2 ministers of advanced education come and go if they speed through the 4-year BA. If that sounds like there's a lot of turnover, it's not. Our ministers last for quite a long time. Since 2003, Ontario's had 12 ministers of colleges and universities. That's counting Malloy once, even though he was the minister twice. In BC, since 2004, 14 ministers, a new one every 18 months. Let's pick a smaller province. In New Brunswick, since the current department was created in 2006, 13 ministers, again, one every 18 months. So a minister of universities who lasts for 2 cycles of the university teaching year is the exception rather than the rule. So once you have the minister on side, in addition to having a wide range of responsibilities, the minister's only going to be around for slightly less than 2 budget years in the fiscal system of most governments. Then you need to take into account that, of course, the university system already has existing priorities. In Alberta, the priorities of the system are set by the province's performance metrics for the advanced education portfolio, and they're driven by the province's advanced higher education strategy. The last one was set by Premier Kenney 6 years ago. I was involved, unfortunately, in the advisory committee that led to that. To summarize, the priorities for the system are all about jobs, skills, and apprenticeships with a focus on trades and the health professions. Or as the minister put it in his most recent annual report to the Legislative Assembly, we're about helping students to pursue rewarding careers in a world and a workforce where change seems to be the only constant. There's nothing else in there about any of the other things that we've talked about today. So the minister's priorities are jobs, trades, and the health professions. Don't think about liberal education or anything like that. That's not part of the strategic planning. Thirdly, you have to remember that, of course, universities report to or answer to others as well. We had heard earlier about the accreditation. In Canada, the accreditation process works a little bit differently. Most provinces have a higher education quality control agency. In Ontario, of course, that's HECCO. The professional schools all have powerful accreditation boards. Research dollars come from a variety of grant-making organizations, primarily the Canadian government. But especially in medical research, there are big dollars in charitable and international organizations with granting capabilities as well. And finally, the core business income. At the University of Calgary, provincial grant money is the minority of our operating budget. The core business income comes from students and their parents. And I hate to tell you, but despite all of the complaints that we have about universities, the students just keep coming, and in big numbers. Enrollment is revenue, and it's driven by demographics and immigration. Parents want their kids to go to university. That's the core political dynamic that drives post-secondary education policy in Canada. Parents want their kids to go to university. Parents will tell you that they want university to be more exclusive, that we should valorize the trades, that of course lots of people should go into trades or into more technical and vocational work, that it's important when I need a plumber that I can find a plumber and that the plumber doesn't cost that much, but my kid is going to university. And that's particularly true if the parent has a university degree already. The kids of university educated parents, their parents want them to go to university. And let me tell you, immigration has changed this formula, because it turns out that people don't move here from the Philippines or from India or from wherever so their kids can go to barbershop college. It turns out that the immigrants who come to Canada, and in Calgary this is a key consideration because it's such an immigration-heavy city, they come to Canada to expect their kids to become doctors and lawyers and teachers just like native-born Canadians. So immigration is not changing this. The enrollment pressure for universities is going to continue. We are going to continue to have business income from tuition for a long time to come. So given that political context, it's no surprise that universities are generally run by their managers and in the interests of their managers and faculty members. Permanent faculty have tenure, which is a strong form of job security. When someone, the minister or one of the 6 advisory panels or a board of governors or a think tank or a university president or a dean tries to tell you how to do your job, the purpose of tenure is that you can tell them to F off. In Canada, most faculty members once hired stay at the institution and even in the department where they first get tenure. While ministers come and go, faculty members are invested in the institution for life. Frankly, we have more at stake than the political officials do. So politically driven reform is as hard with universities as it is in healthcare. There are independent agencies, heavily entrenched interests, and professional norms at stake. Any political reform that a minister is going to deliver, it has to be something the minister can deliver in about a year and a half. The minister is unlikely to be around for his second budget cycle as minister. Besides which, the minister will spend an awful lot of time managing all those political appointees. They take time for care and feeding. They absorb more energy than they generate. As universities vie for the minister's attention against the many other institutions that they're responsible for, anything other than a focus on skills and job market outcomes will have to fight for attention. This is why, in my estimation, in Canada, the political reform efforts for open inquiry on campus have all failed. And I think before we embark on another round of proposed reforms, we have to confront the fact that everything that we've tried so far has failed and failed miserably. For example, 7 years ago, the Ford government, just after he was elected premier, Doug Ford declared colleges and universities should be places where students exchange different ideas and opinions in open and respectful debates. Good idea. It wasn't just the minister who said that, it was the premier who said that. He ordered college and university boards of governors to adopt the University of Chicago's Statement on Principles of Free Expression and to report complaints about free speech issues on campus to the province's independent campus watchdog, the Higher Education Quality Council I referred to earlier. Jason Kenney then followed suit almost as soon as he became Alberta's premier in April of 2019. He ordered Alberta's universities to adopt Chicago principles or lose all of their public funding. Every university board therefore duly copied and pasted Kenney's directive into a board resolution and passed it unanimously within hours. Nor were these policies poorly thought through. They were a response to pressure from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, At the time, I was a donor to their efforts, so I personally invested in the success of the JCCF's efforts here. They had compiled an annual campus freedom index for years. The case for reform was well documented. The JCCF lent its support to the Ford and Kenney governments. When Ford issued his campus free speech policy, JCCF President John Carpay praised it. It's a huge leap forward for Ontario. And he said similar things a few months later when Premier Kenney followed suit. None of this worked. I mean, it worked for the JCCF. John raised a bunch of money and raised the profile of the JCCF as a result. It worked for him. And it worked for Ford and Kenney because they each got a couple of days of headlines about how they were clamping down on woke, blah, 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 authoritarian, blah, 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 on campus. But I don't think anybody thinks last year when we had sort of Palestinian encampments on campus, nobody reached for the Jason Kenney Chicago principles of free speech on campus to read them out at the board meeting where the order was sent out to have the Calgary Police come and clear the encampment before it really got started. And I'm not complaining about the Board of Governors' decision here. I'm just saying that it was not like anything that had been declared earlier about what could go on campus or what couldn't go on campus was done in reference to some free speech document that the provincial government had held a big gun to the university's head and forced them to pass. Moreover, I think in retrospect it's clear that the Kenney government's threat to end provincial funding for the University of Calgary if it didn't pass the policy, what would have happened if the U of C had just said no? We have 35,000 students on campus. By the nature of the University of Calgary, they're almost all kids of local UCP voters. Are we just going to shut down the university and send 35,000 kids home and hope the University of Lethbridge has space for them? Or Mount Royal University has space for them? No, of course not. If Kenney hadn't thought that the university would just bend over and pass his policy word for word, he wouldn't have made the threat because he couldn't have lived with the consequences of a fight from the U of C. We could reach for sort of Rufo-inspired Gramscian power plays on campus. We could engage in the culture war. But isn't that the problem that got us in here in the first place? I don't understand how importing somebody's outside political fight onto campus is going to make the depoliticization of the return of academic standards on campus any better. Peter?
For you. Thank you, Ian. And Peter?
Well, thank you, colleagues, and thank you to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. When I was first asked to participate in this conference, I thought, well, I hope I can make a contribution of some kind, but I hope as well to learn a lot. And as you've heard, I write columns once every 3 weeks or so for the National Post on post-secondary education. And I rely very much on what's going on in our institutions as the sort of inspiration for those columns. And I must say today, panel 1, panel 2, the keynote, your questions, I've learned a lot. And so I'm very grateful to be here. Well, I have a perspective as well. I was asked to assume the perspective of a senior university administrator in talking about what I'm going to talk about. So I offer you this perspective of a senior university administrator, and I know the perspective well because I spent 15 years in president's offices at 3 different universities, and so I do have a perspective on these things, which I will share with you. The topics that I'm going to raise: funding, quickly, governance, and current institutional behaviors. And we've heard a lot about those today, too. My perspective on funding is predictable. Something has to change. Something has to give. Provincial funding of our universities in Canada is haphazard, sometimes formulaic, sometimes incremental, sometimes notional, but with one constant. As a percentage of operating budgets, it is in decline across the country. We might debate the reasons for that. I think that alone would be a rich debate, but it is a fact. It's fair to say that we are on a path. It's not notoriously observable or constant path, But we are on a path from a largely public system of post-secondary education to increasingly private system of post-secondary education. What we need is simply a more systematic approach that rests on explicit foundations. And those foundations might be subjects of debate, and they might differ for many of us, but we need this more systematic approach. We all would agree that there are public and private interests that are at stake here, but what should be the differences? Should tuition be 1/3 of program costs? Should it be 1/2, 1/4, more than 50%? Debatable, of course, debatable, but the point is that universities have to get 100% of program costs from somewhere. And governments must not prevent them from doing so, either by imposing tight restraints upon tuition and tuition increases, and of course, as we've seen, the caps on international students, which have dramatically affected, in some cases, in some universities, dramatically affected income. In other universities, less so, depending upon the percentage of international students. As I said at the outset, something has to give. There has to be either more public money or more private money. And what we need is a vigorous, open debate on which it is going to be. Governance. On the changes that I've observed over many years in university governance, two institutions particularly stand out. Those relating to Board of Governors and the issues relating to senates or their equivalents. They're sometimes called General Faculties Council, University Council, academic assemblies. But they are responsible, as we know, for the academic oversight and decision making. As a president, I've been a member of 3 boards of governors with over many years, hundreds of members, and I've been a member of 3 different senates. First, boards. They become much larger in recent decades. Once composed of people entirely from outside universities, this is before Duffbird, all back in 1966. They now include students, faculty, staff, sometimes union representatives. They become constituency boards, and many of them are too large. They have to be large to accommodate the numbers of the constituencies that are involved. But there are some boards in the country that have 40 members, many with 32. That's not an effective Board of Governors. They become very large. As a president, I used to look to boards to do 2 things. First, to serve as an external check on leadership, plans, and finances. You knew what the internal constituencies felt, but you needed this external check on leadership, plans, and finances. You needed boards to, I did at least, to serve as a buffer between the university administration and governments in particular. If you're doing your job as a university president, you are going to offend government from time to time. I offended government a number of times. And I needed the board to be able to stand between me and the government in order to ensure that the government would hear me fairly and I would hear government responsibly. So that buffer role, I always thought, was very important. In order to do that, you need to have very good public members on these boards. Very good public members who are respected within the institutions and within government in order to perform this role, these roles. These are not always the best people that are appointed to these boards. Sometimes the appointments reflect friendships. People want to be on board, all of which is well and good. But the most important thing is to ensure that you're appointing people with the kind of background, we've talked about it before, and we heard some of it in the keynote, to ask the right questions. That's what you need your board to do, to ask the right questions of the administration and the right questions of government. Boards have to remember that they're actually not there to serve students, faculty, and staff. They have to be cognizant of the students, faculty, and staff and their views and their interpretations and their perspectives. But that's not what boards are there to do. They're there to represent the public interest in oversight of leadership and finances. Next, senates. It's fair to say that many senates have experienced existential crises. They sometimes feel ignored or bypassed by administrations, or sidelined by faculty unions anxious to assume their academic responsibilities. We've seen this in this country, and it doesn't go back 1 or 2 or 3 years. It goes back 10 years at least. Well, administrators must understand the importance of senates. They are actually provided for in legislation. They are legislative bodies. They're not creatures internally of the university. And administrators must understand them and be willing to work closely with them. As for faculty unions, their job is to negotiate employment contracts for their members, not to establish themselves as the academic voice of their universities. Although again, if you look at the recent history in Canada, if you look at the CAUT website over that period of time, the idea of collective bargaining playing an increasing role in identifying academic issues and how they should be resolved, that role of collective bargaining has increased. And so there is now, if it's visible or not, an understandable tension between senates and faculty unions. Now, institutional behaviors, and we've heard a lot about this already. It's a contentious subject. I think it's clear, as I think most people in this room do, institutional neutrality is weakening. It's a very, very substantial issue, whether it has been articulated as such yet, whether it has been recognized fully as such yet. It is a very serious issue as these institutions are perceived and often have done line up with social justice causes or other political causes. It's been happening. I think it's clear too that, and it's emerging, and it's not sudden, it's not abrupt, but a monoculture is developing. And I think it's clear too that broad nonpartisan support for our universities is declining. And again, you get argument on the extent to which this has happened. My role as a university administrator is to offer a perspective on this. First, I would say that governments cannot stand idly by and simply watch these developments. The much coveted institutional autonomy does not mean hands off in all circumstances. As a senior administrator, and this is how it often happens, as a senior administrator, I would anticipate calls or visits from the responsible minister saying, "What the hell are you doing up there?" This is the kind of call that you would anticipate, I think, given some of what we have seen going on. In appropriate cases, I would expect the minister to go beyond asking questions, but to in fact deliver warnings. If you want to continue down this pathway, there will be consequences. And by the way, some of those consequences may be financial. By the way, if I were a university administrator and if those sentiments were out there in government and elsewhere, I'd actually welcome the calls because they would help me, or at least might help me, deal internally with the underlying problems. I think the decline that we have seen in public funding, and it has gone down substantially in all provinces and markedly in some, I think that one of the reasons for the decline is what we have seen as a decline in public confidence in our universities. Now again, there hasn't been much, we've heard that today too. There has not been very much by way of kind of public discourse on this subject. In fact, it's fairly quiet. But when I was chair, as I was years ago, of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, the predecessor of Universities Canada, we had a public opinion poll on how universities were regarded in the general public. And the result was that 77% of Canadians thought that universities were doing a very good job. I would venture to say that if that poll were repeated today, the number would be considerably lower than that, perhaps drastically lower than that. And I think that reflects a confidence issue, perhaps to date quietly registered. But I think unless we are able to deal with some of the issues that we've been talking with, we'll see that decline continue, and it'll be big trouble for all of us.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So Peter, I want to stick on this last point about the monoculture within the institutions. So I'm sure a lot of the people here have been following what's going on in the US. And so since President Trump's re-election, there's this sense in the US at least that there's been this quote unquote vibe shift that has gone on, and that some of the excesses of what happened in the 2020s might be in retreat, and some of the most prominent examples of this are the Ivy League institutions signing these agreements with the Trump administration. And my sense on this side of the border, speaking about my own institution or colleagues in other institutions, I don't get any sense that there's been, that vibe shift has happened here yet, that the internal rules and the culture around things like viewpoint diversity and EDI, that the attitudes at the university are like business as usual. So is my impression wrong? Is that the impression that you get when you talk to former colleagues or people who still work at the upper kind of echelons of these institutions?
That's a biggie, Mark.
That's what we're here for, Peter, is big questions.
It's a very good question. Are the excesses in the institutional culture in retreat in the US? Perhaps, yes, a retreat under pressure, and one certainly underway in the Ivy League and other institutions too. With respect, Mark, to your impression that Canadian universities remain largely complacent on DEI and viewpoint diversity, I think your impression is sound, and I'd add 2 points. First, the complacency of Canadian universities may be the result of Trump's prominence in the retreat in the US. It is seen by some, perhaps many, Canadian university people as kind of affirming DEI. If Trump is against it, maybe we should be more supportive of it. I've heard that view expressed by some in the university environment, and it reflects a kind of polarity and uncomplicated thinking on the subject. Second, and this is more serious from my perspective. I am very troubled by what I perceive as the absence of major public debate within our universities about the issues we've been talking about today. I would have thought, and certainly as I reflect upon my early university experience, issues like these would have generated a high controversy. People on both or several sides, and a fair amount of public debate within the university and beyond the university on the subjects that we've been talking about to date. And yet, maybe I'm too far removed from it. I haven't seen it, I haven't heard it, and I don't know, I don't think it's been going on. That has to change. That really does have to change. And it's going to require courage within the institutions. It's going to require courage from university administrations, and I don't think that has been in surplus supply on some of these issues. If we don't have the debate, if we don't have the discussion, we're going to be in big trouble.
So I have a question for Ian, but just before I get to that, Ian or Ryan, do you want to get in on that last question at all? Or okay.
Agree.
So Ian, I mentioned your Substack in my introduction of you.
Thank you, $100 a year.
Yes, at a low price of $100 a year for a subscription. So I'm going to assert my moderator's privilege here and quote you to yourself.
Good.
So Ian wrote the following on his Substack, that governments, especially the federal government, only have 4 tools at their disposal when it comes to domestic policy: tax it, subsidize it, outlaw it, or buy it. And then he continues, all public policy relies on one or more of these tools. And so, Ian, you're a political scientist, I'm a political scientist, and I think your typology makes a lot of sense. So, but I'm wondering, can one or more of those 4 tools, can we use any of those to improve post-secondary and some of the problems we've been talking about? So on panel 1, we talked about the granting agencies. So could the granting agencies, could we subsidize the form of either viewpoint diversity or to encourage scholarship in certain areas? And do you have a sense of whether that would be advisable, even if you had a minister that was bullish on doing that? So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so let me start with the granting councils and work outwards from there. I mean, the granting councils have an impact really on about 10 or 11 of the universities in Canada in a substantial way. So the granting councils give out, research grants for research projects at all Canadian universities, but it's a relatively small amount of money at most of the universities in Canada. The U15 universities became the U15 universities because there was a felt need to have a member in the Maritimes and a member in Manitoba. Otherwise, it was before that the U13 universities. Those were the 13 universities that received the bulk of federal research funding. And so it's a relatively small number of universities, and those universities have also research funds from US agencies, from international agencies, from charitable organizations, and so forth. So even there, the granting councils are a very important source of funds, in particular in certain areas of research. But it's not like they write the check and the university is the entire creature of the granting council. So we're talking about relative degrees of influence here. I think of all of the Trump administration's reforms, the ones coming out of the health side on encouraging the replicability of research results is the most promising. Forcing National Institutes of Health to set aside some of their funding to encourage scholars to check the research results of other scholars. There is a replicability crisis, supposedly, in some aspects of the medical research and some parts of the social sciences. Certainly there seem to be some problems. And so the administration has set aside some funds in order to make it more attractive for university scholars to make a career out of verifying the results, trying to independently verify the results of published research. That'll help, I'm sure. If there's enough money involved, people will do it. Other than that, for the federal government, I'm not sure there's a lot of possibilities here. You know, the problem of playing games with universities is that universities are full of extremely smart people. And we have ways of deviously avoiding dictates from granting councils. Everybody here who has a granting council grant knows what they're doing. Torque the title of the research grant to fit the priority of SHRC this year. Once you have the money, you can do whatever the hell you want with it. I mean, I don't want to tell tales of the school, but the research funding officers at the U of C are pretty explicit about that guidance to faculty members. Let us help you write your grant in order to maximize the chance of you getting money from SHRC, and then you can do whatever the hell you want with it. I'm like, okay, great. So let's not be too worried about, esoteric writing is not new to the academic world. As we know, it's been around for at least as long as Leo Strauss has been around. Political science joke, I guess. Nobody else thinks it's funny. But anyway, for the provinces, that's different. They have regulatory authorities. Whatever they state as the regulatory requirement for their higher education council sticks. I think if the Ford government really wanted to have free speech guarantees on campus rather than counting on people to complain to the Higher Education Quality Council, it would mandate the Higher Education Quality Council to do every 2 or 3 years a survey of every campus to see what students and faculty think the state of free inquiry is on campus. Try and get enough responses. It's hard because students never respond to these surveys. Like, this is the huge problem, is that student response rates are so low you never get meaningful results. But let's say if you put your mind to it, you can get good results. Try and drive it down to the program level. And then as the programs come up for recertification by HECO, make them answer to the state of student and faculty views of what the diversity of opinion and free inquiry possibilities are, and try and break that out. You can use the Manhattan Declaration or the Buckingham one or whatever, pick a heterodox academy, it doesn't matter which one, or pick them all and throw them all into the survey and come up with some survey questions and see what happens. I think that could help. Segregating funding for deliberate efforts at improving viewpoint diversity on campus, maybe. If that just becomes affirmative action for conservatives instead of affirmative action for progressives, I'm not sure that that's the right path, but I think we could think through what that would look like. I think outlawing it, boy, I'm not sure the criminal law is the approach that I would want to take here.
Thank you, Ian. Peter or Ryan, do you want to get, okay. Okay, so Ryan, I want to get back to the debate between the Heterodox Academy and the Manhattan Institute statement. And again, thinking about, you've just recently authored this very good paper about free expression in Canada for MLI. And then you're a lawyer by training, and think about the role of law as a profession is highly regulated, and the relationship between the law school and the profession, and the professional association. So where do you come down on this debate over, should there be government external pressure to improve some of the things within the law school, or are you more sympathetic to this is going to be something institution by institution, door by door, house by house, that we're going to have to internally improve things?
Great question, Mark. To point out, I shouldn't be drinking water, by the way. Donald Trump drinks water. When it comes to law schools, so the Law Society of Ontario, which is the regulator of the legal profession, and the body above that, which is called the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, is supposed to be ensuring that students get good educations, because it's part and parcel of protecting the public. So when someone has a lawyer, you want to know that the lawyer, can conform to a particular standard of practice and provide a certain level of professional ability. But this is really unpopular. What we're seeing with respect to every law society and state bar in the United States is a desire to abandon these standards. I think Washington State has actually abolished its bar exam. Right? So there's alternate means of purportedly ensuring that someone is capable of practicing. And this is live in Canada too, especially with respect to the accreditation of foreign lawyers. So because I was trained in the United States in law school, I had to come here and take a series of exams to prove that I was at the same level as someone trained in a Canadian law faculty. I went to a top 6 American law school. I had to take a series of exams, passed them all, thank goodness, but I had to do that, right? Now the Federation wants to eliminate those requirements for the accreditation of foreign lawyers who are coming in at numbers that we can't even imagine. Like about 50% of the lawyers being called to the bar in Ontario every year are foreign trained lawyers. And I'll tell you, the United States portion of that is vanishingly small. Okay, so you can kind of imagine. Why don't they want to enforce these standards? That's the question that we should be asking, right? Because it would be very easy for the law side to come in and say, oh, well, it's very easy for us to just make sure that law schools are training their graduates. We'll make the licensing exams very difficult. It's not rocket science, right? And by the way, we know, and I know this from being a board member of the LSO, that we have, what's the correct term for these people? We call them psychometricians. We have psychometricians come in to determine what we call the external validity of the questions on the standardized tests, which is to say, each individual question on a licensing exam, is that really getting to the core of a skill or knowledge that we require them to have? Because what you want to make sure is that there's not some sort of random variability, like some professor used some language in one school and one professor used language in another school, so there's a problem there where they don't map. No, these people with PhDs in this area are making sure, with respect to every question on every standardized test, is it really fair as an assessment? Right? So they put a lot of work into that. So we could just turn up the dial and say, well, no, the pass rate on the licensing exams needs to decline until such point as the quality of the graduates increases. If the raw scores start to track up again, maybe the licensing rate will come up again. That will send a message to law faculties, loud and clear. But the professional bodies do not want to do this. And again, we have to have a debate as to why there's no will right there for that. Why is there no will to say we're going to make sure that foreign trained graduates are at the same level as Canadian graduates, and we're going to make sure that Canadian graduates are as good as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I think, and we can do this in such a neutral way. That's what's so interesting. That, I think, is kind of the penetrating question. If we can do this in a way which really doesn't seem to have any ideological valence to it, it's just, do you understand contract law, right? Maybe what we're understanding now is the crisis we're in is more severe than we typically acknowledge. Oh, by the way, the problem we're going to have, of course, is litigation. I mean, I was listening to the panels this morning. I was thinking of the fact that the Ontario teachers, a subset of Ontario teachers, sued the province of Ontario for making math teachers have to prove that they could do grade 8 math. I wish I was making this up, right? So we've got this real problem where now there's also this entrepreneurialism among the bar of saying, well, no, we will push this theory that every standard, no matter how neutral it might be, is itself systemically biased along various axes. Really dangerous. And that, of course, takes me back to the book's title that I should have mentioned, Mark's book, Judicializing Everything, which you should all buy.
Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to have to put a stop to all the plugs. I opened the door by plugging lots of things, and now I'm, anyway, feeling sheepish. Does Ian or Peter, do you want to get in on the reform from within versus external forces? Ian, you've kind of talked about that a little bit already, but...
The success in the States with these civic education schools is where you find people at the political level. And my outsider's observation, it's not people from the executive branch in U.S. state governments, but it's individual legislators who want to form alliances with people on the big public campuses to begin the reform process from within by forming, pipelines of cash that are segregated from the state legislature to the Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought Leadership, or whatever it's called, and the equivalents at other different places. And by the way, the School of Civic and Economic Thought Leadership at Arizona State University, now run by 2 University of Calgary graduates. I had to put in the plug for the university. Yeah, we took over. succeeded by merit. That's promising. You can't really do that in Canada, of course. That's why I mean you have to start with a minister in Canada. You can't start with the state legislature's committee on higher education. You could go to the Alberta Legislature Committee on Higher Education. There, first of all, there's no such thing. And even if there were such a thing, they'd meet for about 3 hours a year and have no control over the parliamentary appropriation for university grants, so forget it. But I think we need some further thought about what a legislative and financial system would be that could accomplish what that sort of thing is accomplished in the United States, yes. I don't think it's immediately obvious what that would look like, but I think it would be worth putting together a group of people to figure out how you could make something like that work, given that we don't have the same budget system in Canada as they do in the United States.
Okay. Well, I think I want to move to questions from the audience so we stay on schedule. So if the microphones could get circulated to people, and I see our first questioner.
Thanks. So this was touched on a bit in the panel, but I'm curious, I'm puzzled by the fact that Canadian universities don't seem to do what I think is like saving themselves. And looking what Trump is doing to the universities, the potential that a Doug Ford or Pierre Poilievre is going to come with that heavy-handed approach. And it seems to me there's an opportunity for especially like a poli-sci department to get in some more conservatives who are not MAGA people and get those reasonable people into the departments as a way of heading off that potential sort of populist surge in Canada. And I'm curious, first of all, do you think that's what they should be doing? And if it is, why are they not doing that?
I guess my answer is no. If you think if you want to make hiring decisions in response to external political pressures, I can't think of a worse thing to do for a university. I mean, that's the idea that we would fill out a bunch of non-MAGA conservatives, assuming we could find such a group of people and hire them in order to head off some future political problem for the university. Like, forget it, I'm not interested in that. Because that is an affirmative action. Like, those people will never be taken seriously at the university, as you shouldn't take anybody who gets hired for external political reasons. Like, forget it, sorry. The question is, should we stop doing the opposite, which is systematically excluding people based on their political view? Yeah, that I could get behind.
Since the 90s, I've been calling my home province the People's Republic of Alberta, whether it was led by Ralph Klein or Rachel Notley or Jason Kenney and others, because there's rhetoric and then there's reality. Rhetoric in Alberta is reduced spending. Reality is it's often been the highest per capita public spending in the second only to Quebec. And so to your point about Jason Kenney adopting the rhetoric of the Chicago Declaration on the one hand, but no follow through on the other hand, could part of the solution be just pulling back some money from funding for university education, post-secondary education in Alberta, to serve as a discipline?
Would you repeat the last part of the question? I'm sorry, I had trouble.
Given that rhetoric does not match reality in Alberta, between a rhetoric of lower public spending, but Albertans liking generous social programs, including on education. Is it possible to discipline post-secondary education by pulling funding, or is that politically not on?
Well, that has been the last 8 years of post-secondary education in Canada, including in Alberta, right? Part of the Kenney government's problem was at the same time that they were trying to get all this free speech stuff passed through with the big bazooka to the head of the Board of Governors, they wanted to bring per capita funding, provincial funding per student down to the British Columbia level. So we lost about 20% of our operating grant total per student. And Ontario has had a similar situation: frozen tuition, frozen operating grants, costs go up 25% in the last 5 years or whatever it is. So I don't want to suggest there isn't a cost problem. Peter alluded to this, is that he's on this panel in Alberta, we're hoping to square the circle of a very difficult financial situation. I go back to my original comment. Alberta is an extraordinarily highly educated population. We have a high penetration of university degrees amongst kids, citizens who have kids in Alberta, and they want their kids to go to university. At the moment, the province's biggest problem is trying to build out primary and secondary schools fast enough to keep up with the demand for primary and secondary education in the province. The province is spending $7 billion to build 40 new schools in the next 3 years. 3 years. And that will not get ahead of the crisis of overcapacity in the public school system. That will keep pace so that we don't fall any further behind. The question I keep asking is, when those kids are finished grade 12, they're coming to the U of C, or they're coming to the U of A, or they're coming to Mount Royal, or whatever, Lethbridge, or whatever, where are we going to put them? Like, where's the program to accommodate the pressure for growth that's going to come once you've got all those kids through grade 12? And the answer is, we're not planning to do anything about that. Or if there is, we're going to send them to trades training at SAIT or at NAIT so they can all become plumbers. I said, well, that's fine, but like the 50,000 people we took in the last 2 years from the Philippines to fill all of the jobs that we need here, their kids are not. They don't want their kids to. We can send some of them to Queen's, and we can send some of them to U of S and the U of R, and we'll send some of them to UBC, but we've got to educate them here. So I know there's a discussion here about all of the curricular and cultural problems on campus, and they exist. I mean, I'm not denying that. Just trying to say, you know, the question put to me was, how do you get the province to do something about this? The province's problem is what to do with all the people who keep showing up in Alberta. And yes, they know there's a standards problem. Yes, they know there's a cultural problem. Yes, Daniel Smith is well aware of issues on campus. Daniel Smith helped create that problem when, remember, Tom Flanagan said some things about child pornography legislation 13 years ago at the University of Lethbridge. The provincial Conservative Minister of Higher Education called for him to be fired. The federal Conservative Minister of Higher Education called for him to be fired. And Daniel Smith, who had him working as her campaign manager at the time, fired him as the campaign manager for Wild Rose. Tom became persona non grata and then wrote a book called Persona Non Grata about the experience. I think it's his best book. You should read it. It's an excellent book. They know that, but for the time being, we're adding 50,000 people a year, one Red Deer every year to the province of Alberta, and we have one Red Deer's worth of kids looking to come to post-secondary education. We're trying to find space for them.
I would add to that. I've been sitting on a panel of 5 people looking at the funding of post-secondary education in Alberta. And I would say that the government officials that we heard from, and we were with them every meeting, were very, very conscious of the numbers coming through the system in Alberta, and that there is an urgent priority to create capacity, so that these people were not turning their backs on the problem. On the contrary, they were very conscious of it, and I suspect it will register in what they choose to do about the recommendations that our panel is making.
Okay. We're going to go to Stefan next.
All right, so thank you for that. Ian, my question is mostly for you.
Yes.
Because I want to push back on your suggestion that we should basically avoid affirmative action, quote unquote, for conservatives. Because in my view, if the issue is that you're not taking these people seriously after they're hired, don't we already have this problem with the current? Like, not everybody currently at the university is somebody that I can't take seriously, but there's quite a few of them that you know are not there for purely merit-based reasons. It's quite obvious. So in that context, and I mean, I had no idea about your issues, but it's not surprising, because almost every conservative-leaning or even like non-explicitly left-leaning academic I know has had some kind of disciplinary issue with the university. So when you combine the fact that, you know, there's already a problem with certain academics being taken seriously with the actually problematic context that we're dealing with, why should we fight with one hand tied behind our back? Why should we not be going for these kinds of solutions? If only to, at some point perhaps, get back to some kind of equilibrium.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the temptation is there, right? Everybody wants to wear the ring that brings all the power, and so they can correct the problem. The problem is then you're empowering another group of people to go and wreak havoc on behalf of their views. I want to be very careful, but if internally we decide we need to make some institutional space for a wider ranging debate, and we get some external support for that, I think that's a good idea. It's not anti-woke, as our keynote speaker said, it's a-woke or whatever it is, that's fine. If we want to expect the provincial government to come along and enforce an affirmative action program for conservatives, when conservatives hold the provincial cabinet, that might be a good idea for a few years, possibly, depending on who gets hired and how that gets implemented. But in the long term, that's not, if every political party thinks they get to appoint a certain share of the faculty of veterinary medicine at the University of Calgary to share their political point of view, that's pretty much the end of the faculty of veterinary medicine. And I'm not saying it would, I'm aware that I'm saying that there's a problem there for which I don't have an easy solution. I acknowledge that. But I'm worried about the solution being worse than the problem itself.
The context is cultural. It's not a kind of an apportionment of numbers in any particular sense. What we need to recover is the sense that these institutions are diverse, that they are institutions in which you would expect people of many different backgrounds to gather, students as well as faculty, and that you would expect to see and to hear kind of the differences between and among them expressed in the public policy and other debates and discussions that take place. I think we've lost some of the culture in our institutions that we need, and we need to work on that.
I want to hop into stuff because, the pretext for the discipline. I've got a letter in my disciplinary file at my university, I'm not making this up, for leaning aggressively into my Zoom camera. That's,
Leaning aggressively into his Zoom camera.
People were made to feel unsafe by this, you have to understand, right? Scary. I'm a very scary person. But essentially, do we need, here's the question. Do we have diversity as a value now that we're all thinking about it?
Right now, so you lean forward.
Yeah. I'm trying to be scary. Gosh darn it. This is all part of my persona. So do we have diversity as a concept? And now we're fighting over what diversity really should look like. Because we need something to replace excellence. We need something to replace standards. Because if we just thought to ourselves, let's just devise a system that sorts in some fashion, whatever it is. I mean, how good are you at the third declension? Can you take this sentence from Cicero and translate it? Never mind Thucydides. Can we use something to determine who the best people are? Please, can we go back to this? Because if that's the question, then you don't really have to answer these questions as much anymore about how we're going to apportion this so that everyone has their own person. Because maybe what we want people to be identifying with, particularly in the educational context, for someone to see themselves, seeing somebody who's inspirational, seeing someone who's a true thinker, seeing someone who is a bold speaker, right? All of those things as things that we want to emulate. That's where we want the recognition, right? That's where we want the love between the teacher and the student, right? Is around that. And we have to reorient towards that. We've come clearly so far away from this. Why? Why do we have this inability, this lack of courage to say, this isn't Lake Wobegon? Not everyone is above average, and that includes your kids. Oh, you want your kid to be a doctor? Well, then he can get the highest score in the MCAT, and then he'll be a doctor. Otherwise, plumbing is a perfectly good trade, right? I mean, that's the kind of discussion that I'd like to have, where we're saying, yes, we're going to make sure that these professions, law, remain exclusive, because, if you want a lawyer who was selected on the basis of diversity rather than excellence, more power to you, but at least know you're making that decision, right? Most people don't. They just assume that the standards are there. And I'll tell you, the people who are paying the price, for the most part, I can say this because I'm an adjudicator of the disciplinary tribunal, right? Often are people who select lawyers on the basis that they don't speak English or French, and that lawyer speaks English or French. It doesn't speak English or French, but rather speaks that heritage language. Those people are frequently the victims of really, really bad misconduct, whether it's because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of ethics. So what do we have to do within our culture to get back to the notion that it's just okay to select based on excellence? And then, based on the fact that the conservatives have been sharpening, in my experience, I'll just speak from my experience here, we've been constantly required to sharpen all of our faculties because we are hated in the institutions, okay? That makes us better. If we selected based on excellence right now, I think many people on the right side of the political spectrum would just do better because we've gone through that test of adversity, right? Bible verse of the day, as gold is tested in the fire, so is the acceptable man tested in the furnace of humiliation.
Oh, there's
Yep. I came with this comment on the discussions about sort of faculty diversity and hiring and things, and the experience of my experience there is I think often the assumption that everyone I disagree with agrees with everyone else, which I have to say in faculty meetings is definitely not the case. It's not this all agreed left-wing cabal against like that. They're all fighting each other and things. There's more there, but my question was kind of been covered a bit by earlier exchange there. Let's go back to Ian at the beginning. Ian, you laid out the whole Alberta post-secondary governance system there, and my point is these are very complex post-secondary systems. We're focusing here today mainly on universities, mainly on liberal arts within universities, but it's all part of a very big system. And as Peter's comments made, it's one where the public funding is dropping, but also the tuition is very highly regulated, so they can't get money other ways. So the money is really getting constrained more of the system. So, and I'm trying to make this into a question, to say how useful is it to have these very kind of fine-tuned discussions about, really in the end, kind of the liberal arts end of the university, and particularly sort of, high-end students that are achieving well there, when it's a very vast system. Is it really sort of useful to have these fine-tuned discussions and how are they taking into account enough the fact that it's part of a vast system, and in the end, money is the big issue?
What was the gist of that? Is it okay to have a conversation about these very...
Thank you. I need some help here.
No, you.
Yeah, that was you, Ian, I think.
I guess this is what I was trying to drive at, is that, these are useful debates because the liberal arts and sciences are at the core of the university's mission, one would think. If not at the core of the university, this is certainly a core of our enrollment proposition. But as well as I do, I think we're probably of the same mind here, that the liberal arts and sciences are the surplus generating part of the university, so that the surplus of our income over the expenses that we spend on our students can be exported to, well, in our case at the UFC, to keep the medical school alive and to keep the engineering school alive. I know that Carleton has a different mix of programs, but every university has internal cross-subsidization of programs. And but within that context, this is the business of governance and this is the business of governments, because they're dealing with huge numbers and massive political demand. And in Alberta, and I assume here in Ontario, well-organized employer organizations that have demands about skills development so that they can meet their workforce requirements for the future. This is fine. In the case of Alberta, not Ontario, part of Ontario, massive growth of the population across the entire province where it's just hard to keep track. But within that, we have an obligation to educate our students. I realize it's not the concern of government that we educate our students. They don't care. They want students to be satisfied and parents to be satisfied and employers to be satisfied, and up to a certain point, the professional accreditation boards to be satisfied. As to whether there's some actual education going on, of course they're not worried about that. Thank goodness. They wouldn't know what to do if that was their concern anyway, so I'm not too fussed about that. This is a concern for us intramurally inside the university. I guess is what I'm driving at, is that we have to take these questions seriously because we're professionals ourselves. And we want to make sure that our students are getting the best possible education that they can, within the context that, The funding isn't what it was 15 years ago after Harper had laid waste to the place with all of his cuts. It turns out those were the glory days. And before we massified admission to the university, before we went from 20% of the graduating class of your local high school going to university to 60%. Yeah, before. Okay, well, we've got a different set of context now. We still have an obligation to make sure we've got the best possible education for our students, which is why I asked earlier the people who are on the panel, is it possible to get a good university education at your institution? For all of the complaints that we have about the university, and I'm not denying the complaints, I agree with most of these assessments. Do I think it's possible to come and get a good 4-year degree at the U of C? Yeah, I do. Yeah, you have to be careful about where you go. You have to be careful about the programs you register in. You have to be careful about the courses that you take. Sure, caveat emptor, no question about it. There's a lot of crap. Yeah, there's a lot of crap. But there's also excellence. And if you can ask for some guidance and find some help, you can navigate your way through a 4-year degree at the U of C and get an excellent education. I'm convinced of that.
All right, everyone. So we're at time, and so can you please join me in thanking our last panel?